Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Greg Brownderville Dimension. This is a show about the magic of language, and I'm your host, Greg Brownderville. It's Halloween weekend, so I want to tell y'all a couple of stories about interesting encounters with the word casket. Okay, so right out of undergrad, I went back to my home county, Woodruff County, Arkansas, which is in the Mississippi Delta region of Arkansas, and I was working as the editor-in-chief of the small weekly newspaper. And that newspaper had always published the local obituaries from the funeral home. And all my life, those obituaries had used the term pallbearers. But for some reason, they had taken to using the term casket bearers. And I had noticed this with some puzzlement. But the funeral homes worked with the families to produce these obituaries, and apart from correcting typos, we just didn't mess with them. We just published them as they were. One day, I got a call from an old Southern belle in the city of Cotton Plant, which is one of the towns in that county. And this lady said, "Mr. Brownderville, I have noticed that you all have begun using the term casket bearer in your obituaries, and I want you to know that I find this term exceedingly vulgar and unacceptable. It has nothing of the respectfulness and sense of ceremony that the word pallbearer conveys." And so I explained to her that I just published them as they came in from the funeral home, and that didn't make her feel any better, and she said, "Well, you have lost a reader forever." So there you have it. Casket bearer lost me a reader at the Woodruff County Monitor newspaper. Well, a few years back, I was talking to a friend of mine who's from New Jersey, and he had gone to a family reunion that for some reason was held in the Smoky Mountain region of Tennessee. And he and his brother and his brother-in-law were driving around in that area during this time when this family reunion happened, and they were hungry, and they saw this barbecue joint in a town called Cosby. And the barbecue place, to hear my friend tell it, was just kind of a trailer with a couple of picnic tables out in the yard. So they walked in, and I should mention that the brother-in-law had he was a new father, and he had his baby in one of those sling things. And so they walked in, and a boy, maybe 12, 13 years old, walked up to my friend's brother and said, "You like bald nuts?" And the brother said, "Well, I don't know that I really have a preference, to tell you the truth." He said, "Bald nuts, you like them or don't you?" And he pointed at some boiled peanuts. So this was the first weird thing that happened. So they ordered their food. They went out to the picnic table. Next thing that happened is that same boy came out, this time with a girl who was a few years younger, maybe 10 years old. And the brother-in-law was a very gregarious fella, and so he tried to strike up a conversation with the kids, and he was trying to talk to the girl, and he asked her what her name was, and she just wasn't responding. And the boy said, "She's Dave." And so the brother-in-law thought, well, that's sort of a peculiar name for a girl, but okay. So he said, "Well, hello, Dave. How are you doing?" And she just kind of stared at him blankly. And the boy said, "No, she's Dave. She can't hear you." And so he put it together that was the way they were pronouncing deaf, which was weird for me because I grew up hearing people say deef, but I had never heard Dave. But, these things vary from region to region. All right, so they disappeared. The kids disappeared again. And the next thing that happened is that the barbecue came out, and it was excellent. They were enjoying it. But they looked up, and there that boy was again. And this time, he was pointing a gun at them, and they just froze. And he looked at him and said, "Looks like somebody's going to be needing a casket tonight." And the table just erupted. They got the heck out of there. But one of them happened to notice that it was, in fact, a cap gun, but it was still enough to scare them. So they got out of there. And I talked to my friend about it, and he said, I've wondered since then whether in their telling we were like really weird and rude or something. Or, I don't know how those kids perceived what happened. So a couple of casket stories to get us started. And now a little another story about a strange word, dumbsettin. You ever heard that term, dumbsettin? I've only ever heard it from one person, my grandma on my mother's side, Edry Molina Dickerson Woodall. She told me about it when I was a little kid, that she and her girlfriends, when they were 12 or 13, used to do this thing called dumbsettin. And I said, well, what is it, Mimi? She said, well, we would go out trick-or-treating like the little kids, but when people would open up their doors, we would just barge right on in. And we would go on in and sit down in the living room and just sit a spell, maybe stay for 5 or 10 minutes, but refuse to speak. No matter what the people said or did, we wouldn't say a word. And after a little bit of time, we would get up, just mosey on out. And that was called dumbsetting, and they got a big laugh out of it, the girls did. And apparently, I'm the only person in our family that Mimi ever told about this, because my mother's never heard anything about it. I asked my siblings, neither of them ever heard anything about it. If you are listening to this and you're a member of our family and you did know about this, get in touch with me. I'd like to compare notes. But for some reason, Mimi chose to tell me about this. And a couple of years back, Mimi passed away in 2008. But just a couple of years ago, I got curious about it. And I thought, well, I've never read about this. And by the way, if somebody has read about this, like in a folklore book, let me know too. I would love to know if there's been some folklore work done on it. I haven't encountered it. But I got curious about it, so I started Googling it, seeing if I could figure anything out online. And what kept coming up, I was just Googling things like Halloween, dumbsetting, just putting those words in to see what would happen. And what kept coming up is something called the dumb supper. And it was in most of the websites I found, it was associated with a folklorist of whom I was already aware, named Vance Randolph, because he's famous for having done a bunch of field work in the Arkansas Ozarks and to some extent in Missouri. But he's closely associated with the Arkansas Ozarks. And Vance Randolph had collected a number of stories about these dumb suppers. And the way these would work is that young girls would, often on Halloween night, but sometimes, or around this time of year anyhow, but in some regions around May. And this is interesting because there's an old, supposed to be an old Celtic idea that right around Halloween and around the May, which is May 1st, the veil between the living and the dead, the quick and the dead, is thinnest, and you can make contact with the spirit world much more easily, sometimes by accident or even when you don't want to. And so you get that kind of permeability of the veil between us and the spirit world around the May and around this time of year. And those are the two times when dumb suppers happen. It would be completely dark. Young girls would prepare a supper, doing everything backwards, walking backwards. And here I'm reminded of the Dominican folklore of La Ciguapa, the woman with her feet on backwards. And there's some, if you're interested in that, check it out. You can find some stuff online. There's some interesting parallels between the lore around La Ciguapa and the lore of the dumb supper. But anyhow, these girls would do everything backwards. And they would often make a pone of, as Vance Randolph says, a pone of cornbread and with salt in it. And they would serve the meal, everything in total silence, and sometimes right around the stroke of midnight. You get variations from region to region, and often the winds would blow out the candles at the stroke of midnight, this sort of thing. And the idea was that you would there would be a place set at the table for your future spouse. And in Vance Randolph's telling, this would be the future husbands of these girls. And in phantom form, these future husbands would come into the house sometimes and sit down at the table. These were called dumb suppers. It's almost as if what Mimi and her friends had going was a prankish inversion of this. Instead of having these male figures coming in from the outdoors as phantoms, the girls would come in and behave like phantoms, not speaking, being kind of shadowy and mysterious. There's some kind of prankish inversion of the dumb supper, perhaps, and maybe that's what had a different name, dumbsetting. As I've been thinking about Halloween, I've been contemplating the way in which this holiday seems to pair life and death, eros and thanatos. So you have candy and the verve and brio of childhood being paired with death, skeletons, old age, all of that. And we see in a number of Halloween precursors this same motif. Like in Britain, there was the tradition of souling, in which kids would go around and sing a souling song, and people would give them these little cookie-like, tea cake-like things, often with crosses made on them with knives, or it's kind of an impression of a cross on the little cookie. Those cookies were called soul cakes or souls. And just a number of traditions like this. So you had this idea of, in the soul cake, death and a treat all in one. And of course, the same thing happens with the Latin American Day of the Dead with the sugar skull. We get the sugary treat, but also the image of death. And this connection between sweet treats and death will play out in a poem that I'll be discussing a little bit later today. I am a fan of boxing, and there's a very interesting American boxer from Tuscaloosa, Alabama, named Deontay Wilder. Just listen to all this great language that's part of this story. Tuscaloosa, Deontay Wilder. I mean, how do you get a name like Deontay Wilder and then turn out to be a great heavyweight boxer? It's as though a poet were behind the universe when you see things like this. Deontay is a good wordsmith. He gives very interesting interviews. And I recalled that a few years back, he had a fight with a Cuban fighter named Luis Ortiz. They fought one time, and Ortiz gave Deontay a battle. Had him in trouble, I think, in the 7th round, but Deontay Wilder wound up knocking him out. And then they were going to have a rematch, and as it turns out, Deontay knocked him out again. Deontay Wilder knocks everybody out, except Tyson Fury. Tyson Fury has knocked Deontay Wilder out twice. Pretty much everybody else gets knocked out by Deontay Wilder, it seems. But in the run-up to that second Luis Ortiz fight, Deontay Wilder was interviewed, and he was talking about how he had blessed Ortiz once. You know, they'd fought once before, and he wanted to bless him again. It's a strange way to talk about it. I think he partly meant that Ortiz makes a lot of money on these fights because Deontay Wilder's a big draw. It was just a strange way to talk about it when he's knocking the guy out. He's like, I blessed him once, I'm going to bless him again. And then he said the fascinating thing. He said, he's already had some of these sweet potatoes. Now he's coming back for seconds, and I'm ready to fill his mouth full. It's just one of the weirdest things I ever heard a boxer say. He's going to fill his mouth full with sweet potatoes. And Deontay Wilder has said before that he wants a body on his record. It's a gruesome thing to say, talking about killing somebody in the ring. This is one legal way to kill somebody, is to kill them in the boxing ring. And one minute he's saying that, next minute he's talking about blessing people and feeding them sweet potatoes. Made me think about this Halloween motif. All right, so let's talk about the Halloween poem I would like to share with y'all. Now, it's not really a Halloween poem, but I think of it as a Halloween poem. It's the Eve of St.Agnes by John Keats. I've always loved this poem, or I've loved it since I discovered it. Keats, it's just incredible to think about what he achieved in his short life. He died, I think, at the age of 25. He proves in a poem like the Eve of St.Agnes that he can do lyric and narrative at the highest levels at the same time. He can tell a complicated, interesting story and deliver amazingness down at the phrase level. Just one terrific thing after another. This is difficult to do. It's hard to do either one of those two things well. Tell good stories in poetry or deliver up the magic at line level. Keats does both of them. If you want to read a contemporary poet who I think has this same capacity to do both of those things, to do those things simultaneously, check out the poet Rachel Reinhardt. I admire her work very much. She has a book called The Church in the Plains. I think she's another poet who brings the who's very good on both of those levels. It's not the commonest thing to run into in the world of literature. So, as with any poem, you need to experience the language of the poem. So I'm going to, in the show notes, leave links to the poem online so you can read it. And you might also want to listen to it. I found a really good audio version of it on YouTube, so I'll link to that as well. Just to give you a little bit of a sense of the poem, it starts out like this. St. Agnes Eve, bitter chill it was. The owl, for all his feathers, was a cold. The hare limped trembling through the frozen grass, and silent was the flock in woolly fold. Numb were the beadsman's fingers while he told his rosary, and while his frosted breath, like pious incense from a censer old, seemed taking flight for heaven without a death, past the sweet Virgin's picture, while his prayer he saith. So we have these, the frame of the poem, the beginning and the end, are quite Gothic. A lot of images of old age and cold and death and some downright scary stuff towards the end. And that this is going to be contrasted with the warmth and life of the young lovers. And this made me think about this time of year. Now, St. Agnes was a Christian martyr of the 4th century in Rome, and the St. Agnes Eve is actually January 20th, and that's when this poem is set. But the contrast that's set up in the poem between warmth and light on the one hand and cold and dark on the other made me think about this time of year and the both andness of it, the rich ambiguity of it emotionally, spiritually, and climatically. Because like here in Texas where I live, we're close enough still to the summer that we can remember those warm days, and we actually are still getting some warm days, but we're also feeling that chill, that premonition of the dead of winter. And all that's happening in a given week. And so there's that emotional blending that happens. And you can see it in the natural world as well. I think this is one reason why fall and spring, Halloween and the May are mythologically and folklorically associated with these encounters between the living and the dead. So in this story, there's this young girl named, maybe a teenager, let's say, named Madeline. And Madeline is in love with a teenage boy named Porphyro. But the trouble is, their families hate each other. They're feuding. It's a bit like Romeo and Juliet in this respect. Now, there's this folklore, and you'll see why I'm pairing this with the story I told you all about the Dumb Supper. There's some folklore around St. Agnes Eve. The idea was that if a girl fasted, didn't eat supper, took off all her clothes, went to bed, and lay down on her back and looked up and prayed, she would fall asleep and she would have dreams, or she would have visions in her dreams of her future husband. And so Madeline has heard about this from the old ladies. The poem says, they told her how upon St. Agnes Eve young virgins might have visions of delight, and soft adorings from their loves receive upon the honeyed middle of the night, if ceremonies do, they did aright. As supperless to bed, they must retire, and couch supine their beauties lily white, nor look behind nor sideways, but require of heaven with upward eyes for all that they desire. Full of this whim was thoughtful Madeline. The music yearning like a god in pain she scarcely heard. Now, what are we talking about with the music? What a great line, by the way, right? The music yearning like a god in pain. Well, Madeline's families, that she lives in this big old medieval castle kind of house, and it's quite Gothic. Well, her family are having a big party that night with loud music and drunkenness and debauchery. And she's not participating. She's in her bedroom undertaking the St. Agnes Eve rituals, hoping to have a vision of Porphyro. So when it says she scarcely heard the music, that's what we're talking about. Okay, so a little bit about her ritual. There's this beautiful moment in the poem in which Madeline is praying and hoping for this St. Agnes Eve miracle. And it says, "Full on this casement shone the wintry moon, and threw warm gules on Madeline's fair breast." What are gules? Well, gules is a heraldic red. So it's a red associated with like coats of arms and that sort of thing. So it may have been that there was a red coat of arms on her casement or on her window, and that the moonlight was coming through that red and throwing that red color on her skin. So it says, "Full on this casement shone the wintry moon, and threw warm gules on Madeline's fair breast, as down she knelt for heaven's grace and boon. Rose bloom fell on her hands together pressed, and on her silver cross soft amethyst, and on her hair a glory like a saint." So these beautiful color, these beautiful light is falling on her body, transforming her, it seems. The poem says, "She seemed a splendid angel newly dressed, save wings for heaven. Porphyro grew faint." Now, why would Porphyro grow faint? Okay, so this is the part that I haven't told you yet. Porphyro had it in his, now remember, he's the guy that loves Madeline and whom Madeline loves, but whom she can't be with easily because of the feud between the two families. He decided to come through a storm. It's storming out that night, and it's quite cold. It's January 20th after all. But he comes to the castle to see, hoping to catch a glimpse of Madeline. And it's quite clear in the poem that he knows it's St. Agnes Eve. But it's not clear. I get the sense maybe he didn't have a fully hatched plan about what he was going to do until he got to the castle. But he may have had something of a plan. There is one person in that household, in that castle anyway, who's sympathetic to the notion that Porphyro and Madeline love each other and want to be together. And that's this beldam named Angela, this very old woman. And Porphyro encounters her in the castle once he slips in. And he comes up with this idea for a prank, a trick. It's not I don't know if I should say prank, but a trick. The poem uses the word stratagem. And he tries to get Angela to go along with him. And at first she protests, but then she goes along with him. And here's the idea. Madeline is going to be in her bedchamber trying to conjure a vision of Porphyro. And he wants himself, the real Porphyro, to materialize there. So Angela helps him sneak into this closet in Madeline's bedroom, and she even goes and gets some fancy foods from the feast that they're having that night in the castle and brings those into the closet so he has them, so he can serve them. Okay, so Madeline goes to bed, undresses, goes to bed, and it's a little disturbing what's happening the poem invites us to imagine this as folkloric and almost in the land of the fairyland of the imagination. If you think about it as real life, it's quite disturbing, the peeping Tomism of the whole thing. Because here's this guy in her bedroom, kind of spying on her for his own pleasure. And then what happens is, he actually, once she's asleep, and by the way, her ritual works. She is, in fact, having visions of Porphyro in her dream. And while that's happening, he creeps out of the closet. And that's when we get this amazing passage. It says, "And still she slept, an azure-lidded sleep. I love that phrase, azure-lidded sleep. You're thinking of like the bluishness of the eyelid. And still she slept an azure-lidded sleep in blanched linen, smooth and lavendered, while he from forth the closet brought a heap of candied apple, quince, and plum, and gourd, with jellies soother than the creamy curd, and lucent syrups tinct with cinnamon, manna, and dates, in argosy transferred from Fez, and spiced dainties, every one from silken Samarcand to cedared Lebanon. These delicates he heaped with glowing hand on golden dishes and in baskets bright of wreathed silver. Sumptuous they stand in the retired quiet of the night, filling the chilly room with perfume light. And so something rather interesting happens, because Madeline is having this vision of Porphyro in her dream, but she wakes up and there's the real Porphyro. And she's disappointed because the IRL Porphyro can't measure up to the dream Porphyro. And she says as much. She says, your eyes look kind of sad and dreary now, but in my vision, they were spiritual and clear. Bring me back that Porphyro. That's what she's asking him to do. But then the truly magical and interesting and sort of ambiguous thing happens. The poem says, into her dream, he melted. So something happens there, and we're left to wonder, okay, so is she seeing the real Porphyro still, or is she seeing the dream Porphyro, or some composite of the two? I mean, what exactly is happening? But whatever happens, he says, come with me, and she agrees to come with him. And they have to get out of the castle, but luckily, the partiers, the wassailers, they're all passed out. They all got drunk on Rhenish and the sleepy mead, as the poem says, and they're out like a light. And the way Keats presents this escape from the castle is super interesting. We don't really see the lovers doing what would need to be done to get out of the castle. It's as though the castle itself is just opening up to let them out, the way he writes it. So he doesn't say the lovers slide the bolts on the door and the lovers turn the key and the lovers push the door open or slide it open, whatever. The way the poem delivers this up, first of all, okay, we see this kind of magical effect inside the castle. It says, the arras, rich with horseman, hawk, and hound, fluttered in the besieging wind's uproar, and the long carpets rose along the gusty floor. So what's this about? Well, the arras is like this heavy Flemish curtain that would be embroidered with scenes, images, and the wind in the arras seems almost to be bringing those embroideries to life. And it reminds me of how these not quite human-seeming lovers are also being inspirited with the poetic imagination brought to life by Keats. And the poem goes on to say, they glide like phantoms, talking about the lovers, they glide like phantoms into the wide hall. Like phantoms to the iron porch they glide. Now, the poetic form that he's using here does not dictate these repetitions. They glide, they glide. There are other repetitions like this in the poem. This is something Keats is adding, and it gives the poem this kind of song-like quality, which I think elevates it even more from workaday life, just the quotidian. Okay, so now, like phantoms, that's also repeated. They're gliding. And the poem goes on to say, by one and one, the bolts on the doors, the bolts full easy slide. The chains lie silent on the foot-worn stones. The key turns, and the door upon its hinges groans. Notice the bolts slide, the key turns, the door on its hinges groans. These things seem simply to be happening. It reminds me of when you're winning a game of solitaire and everything's just falling into place. As if by magic, everything is opening up and there are no impediments. And then the poem ends, it says, and they are gone. Ages long ago, these lovers fled away into the storm. That night, the Baron dreamt of many a woe, and all his warrior guests, with shade and form of witch and demon and large coffin worm, were long benightmared. I love that word, benightmared. Angela the Old, she's the beldame who helped Porphyro. Angela the Old died, palsy twitched, with meager face deformed. This is really getting into Halloween territory. The beadsman, after 1,000 Aves told, for I, unsought for, slept among his ashes cold. So Angela and the beadsman both die at the end, and it gets quite gothic and scary there towards the end. So that's a little bit of that poem. You get a sense. I want you to get a sense of the language, because the life of it is all in the language. It's not in a plot summary. There's been some critical debate about this poem. Not everybody sees it as one of Keats's great poems. I do see it as one of his great poems. I would put it up there with the great odes. But a lot of people don't. And one of the big objections to the poem, if we're trying to decide whether it's one of Keats's best, is that we don't really we care more about Keats's pictures, his incidental descriptions and lovely phrases, than we do about his characters in this poem. That they don't seem quite fully human, and we don't care about them the way we would if they did seem real and human, if they seemed fully human. And that the poem ultimately falls short because it's just a lot of prettiness in its imagery and phrases. And so you might imagine a question emerging out of that. And this, let's first think of it as a life question. Can there be a viable life that's mostly lived in the dreaminess of the imagination? Is that a good life? Or do you have to go out and engage more with whatever real life is? You shouldn't just be living in the la-la land of your imagination. How do you feel about that? What's the right balance? Isn't there also a danger of not having a sufficiently alive imagination? There's an impoverishment there. So there's a lot to think about in that question. But there's an analogous aesthetic question. And the aesthetic question or literary question might be framed this way. Can there be a viable poem or a good poem, a great poem, that's all about the dreaminess of the imagination? Or will that fall short? There is this feeling in the poem sometimes that the characters become almost like divine, sublime cartoons. Remember those gules falling on Madeline? It was transforming her into a thing of fancy, a thing of the imagination. And in fact, towards the end of the poem, as I said, Keats presents the lovers as phantoms, his like phantoms, twice. He says that. We have Porphyro's glowing hand when he's preparing the feast of delicates. I didn't read this part to you, or recite it rather, but the storm outside that they run out into is called an elfin storm from fairyland. You might think of that as the energies of Keats's imagination. We've got the bolts and the key and the door just opening themselves, as it were, the way it's rendered in the language. We've got the arras, rich with horseman, hawk, and hound, coming to life in the breeze. Is that an image of what's happening Does that image suggest that the characters, the lovers, are embroideries that are being brought to life only momentarily by the winds of Keats's imagination? And then we have this image of a wondrous riddle book in the poem. I didn't read that or recite that part, but there is this image in the poem of a wondrous riddle book, as if all the wondrous things of the world could come to life out of that book. And it wouldn't be life exactly. It would be legend or fairy lore, perhaps. And then there's something very interesting in this poem happening with verb tense. The verb tense is unstable. Is it past tense? Is it present tense? Well, it's a bewildering mix of the two. And I've had friends try to make arguments to me to the effect that, oh, there's a pattern. Every time such and such is going on, it's present tense, and every time something else is going on, it's past tense. And I've never been persuaded by those arguments. They've always seemed kind of, each one seems like a stretch to me. What I think is happening is that the poem is simply unstable. It's indecisive. It's in this kind of quantum indeterminacy whereby it hasn't decided yet whether it's fact or fancy. The past tense I associate with facticity, something that happened. Such and such happened on this date. That's fact. That's past tense. The present tense I think of as the kind of alt-geringa of poetry. You know, when we do literary criticism, if we were talking about something that happened in the 5th chapter of a novel, we might say, in the 5th chapter, such and such occurs. Why don't we say occurred? Well, it's always happening in the 5th chapter. There's an eternal present in literature there. And I used the word alt-geringa when I was reading Joseph Campbell's wonderful trilogy on world mythologies in the section on primitive mythology. He tells about this Central Australian people. I think they're called the Aranda people. That may not be quite right, but that's what I'm remembering. Who believe that their great mythological stories, the great mythological events that they believe in, are always happening in a different dimension called the alt-geringa, which translates to something like dream time. If we were to think of this in the context of Christian lore, for example, we might say, it's not simply that Christ died on the cross in such and such a place on such and such a day. It's that he's always dying on that cross, and that he's also always being resurrected. These things are always happening. That's the alt-geringa I'm talking about. And the Eve of St.Agnes seems to be flirting with that boundary there between facticity and between fact and fancy. And the poem is always on the verge, it seems, of flickering or gleaming into that alt-geringa. And that's the very thing that some readers and critics are bothered by, that it doesn't seem like human fact, it seems like fairy fancy. And it's true. I mean, I read this poem and I think all of Disney's millions and technological know-how could not come up to the standard that Keats reaches with his pictures in this poem. There's something special about a picture that emerged in your own imagination. Keats obviously facilitated it, but my version of the pictures in this poem will not be the same as yours because we have two different imaginations. So they're coming to life inside us, and they're both ours and Keats's. Well, what about these pictures? I'm talking about this as if they are, photographs, but I want to say something about that and how it plays into this whole question of what kind of life and what kind of poetry do we want. In the trailer to this podcast, episode 0, only last week, I made a comment to the effect that poetic language can make moments more keepable. I want to nuance that a little bit because here's what I'm not saying. I'm not presenting a picture of poetry as taxidermy. I'm not saying that poetry scissors moments out of life and then attaches them with magnets to the icebox or the refrigerator. What I mean by moments is that great poetry and good language in general will serve as a portal back into the life that it came from, back into motion and rhythm and the fullness of life. Not taxidermy, not scissored out moments, but these are portals into the fullness of life. And the expert on this is, I think, of our time is Ian McGilchrist, who has a great YouTube channel called Channel McGilchrist, and is the author of well, he started as a literary critic, which makes perfect sense to me. He loves poetry. He has a book of literary criticism, and then he has a book called The Master and His Emissary, and a new one called The Matter with Things. The Matter with Things is all about this whole business of process versus things. He encourages us, and I think poetry encourages us to see life in motion, in process. Well, form is one way that poetry enacts that motion. The poem, the Eve of St.Agnes, is written in Spenserian stanzas. And, you know, I came across a book many years ago when I was in undergrad. I came across a book called Poetic Meter and Poetic Form by Paul Fussell, which I love. I still love that book. It was so helpful to me. But he says something in that book that bothered me. He was talking about this very poem, and he, like me, is a huge fan of the poem, and he says that Keats out-Spencers Spenser in this poem, that he handles the Spenserian stanza, dare we say it, better than Spenser ever did. Now, this is arguable, obviously. That's what Fussell said. But then he went on to say, no contemporary poet would ever think of writing in Spenserian stanzas. Well, I took this as a personal challenge. I was already interested in writing in Spenserian stanzas because I was such a fan of The Bower of Bliss, a section of The Faerie Queene by Spenser, and of the Eve of St.Agnes. But when I read that in Fussell, I knew I was going to try to write something in Spenserian stanzas. And I wrote a poem called A Soldier Gets Home, which is in my book, Gust, if you want to check it out. But there is this type of thing shows up a lot, and it's something that's kind of like floating around in the culture, this idea that certain received forms are passé. You know, nobody who's relevant would think of writing with, you know, meter and rhyme, something like that. And I want to challenge that notion. I don't think it will bear up under scrutiny. I would encourage you not to think of such things as meter and rhyme as arbitrary ornament or, you know, just gewgaws that are arranged arbitrarily on top of the stuff that's essential in poetry. Rather, you think about poetic meter, you're thinking about something primal. It's rhythm, it's the heartbeat, it's the blood, it's the body, it's footsteps, it's sex, it's dancing, it's physical, it's music. And that's part of this feeling of motion and aliveness that I'm talking about, that a poem and good language in general will, but especially a great poem, will be a portal into. The Spenserian stanza, it's a 9-line stanza. You can think of it as being composed of 2 symmetrical halves, but that's not quite the whole story. So the rhyme scheme goes A, B, A, B, B. And the second half goes, okay, so A, B, A, B, B. That's 5 lines, okay? The second half goes B, C, B, C, C. Also 5. You think, well, I thought you said it has 9 lines. Well, that's the way this works, is that the first half, A, B, A, B, B, that last B is the first line of the second symmetrical half that I was talking about, B, C, B, C, C. So that line is actually pulling double duty. And that makes those 2 sections interlocking. And that's that interlocking quality that gives the stanza unity. Paul Fussell helped me understand this in that very book I was just talking about. He talks about how the quatrain form AABB is not satisfying precisely because it has no interlocking parts, and it has a tendency to dehiss or split off. I mean, why have an AABB quatrain? Why not just have a poem in couplets? Now, I would say, what if you're writing a poem about fissures or drifting apart? Then the AABB quatrain may be just what the doctor ordered. It all depends on the context. But there's a real unity and cohesion to the Spenserian stanza form. Keats had a real debate with himself, and this is thoroughly well documented in his letters and in his poems. And if you want to really see the details on this, I would recommend this an old essay, excuse me, essay published, I believe, in 1961 by Jack Stillinger. I'm not even sure I'm pronouncing the guy's name right. Stillinger. It's called something like The Hoodwinking of Madeline, Skepticism in the Eve of St.Agnes, something like that. And in this essay, Stillinger shows how this debate plays out in Spenser's life. Now, I mean, in Keats's life. Have I been saying Spenser? I'm talking about Keats. Now, Stillinger really comes down on the side that Keats matured and left behind his younger ideas, young, immature ideas, that the poetic imagination that fancy can satisfy, and turned toward or began to adopt the idea that you really need a more human poetry, a poetry that is grounded in the everyday. I think of Richard Wilbur's poem "The Undead," the salt quotidian savor, just of real life, everyday life, not fancy, not poeticized life, but life as we really know it. I don't see it as being as clear as all that. I think that the debate was alive inside Keats. And I would say there's something to what Stillinger's saying. And Keats himself actually critiques the poem somewhat harshly. He says he had a very interesting way of saying it. Keats thought that the Eve of St.Agnes was too smokable. And we see it was an early poem in 1819, which was the great creative year for Keats, and you do see a shift in his work after that. Stillinger's onto something. There's no question about that. But it's not as if the love of fancy dies away utterly in Keats. And at the end of this poem, we're left with something so incredibly beautiful that I'm perhaps a bit surprised to say that I do find it satisfying, even though I will allow that these characters do not seem real in the way that Jude and Jude the Obscure by Thomas Hardy, a great novel, seems real. I mean, they do seem a bit like those embroideries on the arras that are being brought to life by the winds of inspiration. And yet I love the poem because what makes it work is the sheer magic of Keats's language. So if he was, I mean, maybe after he wrote the poem, he thought that it was too much that it depended too much on fancy and pictures, as some critics have said. But when he wrote it, I mean, he was on fire, and he made that thing work, even though the characters do seem like folkloric entities, let's say. It just at the end of the poem, when the lovers light out into the elfin storm, we have to ask ourselves, do we believe? Not do we believe, but did this work? Did the poem's charms enchant us deeply enough to make this poem succeed? For me, the answer is yes, but you'll just have to read it for yourself, and I hope you will. If you want to see how this debate plays out in Keats, maybe look at, I would encourage you to look at a few poems, maybe juxtapose Ode on a Grecian Urn, one of his great odes, with Yeats's Sailing to Byzantium. Because in both of those poems, we have this question: would it be better to be an art object or to be a dying, but because dying, also living creature? If you're a living creature, you're dying. And the only way to be alive fully is to also be dying. And I think that Keats and Yeats come down in slightly different places in those poems. It'd be interesting for you to check that out. And Yeats has a poem called The Stolen Child about fairies luring a human child away from the human world. And the child goes. He goes away with the fairies keep wooing him, seducing him, saying, "Come away, O human child, to the waters and the wild, with a fairy hand in hand, from a world more full of weeping than you can understand." And the fairy world seems so magical, and the child is enticed, and indeed he goes. But at the very end of the poem, as he's going, the fairies say, "Away with us he is going, the solemn-eyed. He'll hear no more the lowing of the calves on the warm hillside." Or something about, or the kettle on the hob sing peace into his breast, or see again the brown mice bob round and round the oatmeal chest. So he's not going to experience these homely scenes of earth, for he comes, the human child, to the waters and the wild, with a fairy hand in hand, for the world's more full of weeping than he can understand. And so all of these poems are asking that question. And it ends up being a question that matters, I think, on a day-to-day basis to human beings whose imaginations are alive, but whose lives are full, and who want to engage outwardly with the world, but also want to have lively imaginations. You know, where's the sweet spot in the tension between the fairy realm and the lowing of the calves on the warm hillside? Interestingly, Keats, so he dies at 25, and when some critics say that when he had this change of heart around these issues and wanted a kind of harder, earthier, or not earthier necessarily, but a more human poetry, he was revising a long work of his called Endymion. And Yeats, I think, had a similar epiphany when he was revising and finalizing his first book of poems, and he was about 24, I think. There's a book called The Wanderings of Usheen and Other Poems. He wrote, a friend of his, a young Irish poet named Catherine Tynan, something along the lines of, "I have buried my youth and raised above it a cairn, M-dash, of clouds." A cairn being a burial structure. So he put an M-dash in there. I've raised above it a cairn of clouds. He thought that there was too much Celtic dreaminess in that early poetry. But what's interesting to me is that even in late Yeats, that Celtic dreaminess is never gone. It's always there to assert its presence. I have a feeling much the same would have been the case with Keats, not Celtic dreaminess, but the dreaminess of his earlier work, I think, always would have asserted its presence, perhaps in a different measure, as he had, if he had kept writing, if he had stayed alive and kept writing. Well, before I go, I just want to give a shout out to Mónica, Ojeda, and Sarah Booker, who guest edited the Halloween issue of Southwest Review, which is fantastic. I urge you to order it. It's such a good issue. Mónica and Sarah, by the way, is an associate editor at Southwest Review. And Mónica and Sarah, have been shortlisted for the 2022 National Book Award in Translated Literature for Jawbone. This is a novel that was written originally in Spanish by Mónica and then translated into English by Sarah. Really quite an honor. Huge congrats to them. This was an important issue for us at Southwest Review that they guest edited. it's the first time we translate a lot of literature at Southwest Review, and we publish a lot of translated literature, and we publish a lot of Latin American literature in general. But this was the first time we put out a call in both English and Spanish, and we accepted work in Spanish and then translated it in-house. It's also the first full color issue we've done. It's color not just on the covers, but front and back cover, but on the interior, in the interior pages as well. So it's a great one to get your hands on. I know that we're here at Halloween already, but we just talked about the Keats poem, which is set on January 20th. And really this is a season. And this whole season from Halloween to Carnival is, you can think of as a time of year and it all has those notes of, from beginning to end there, you hear those eerie notes, even in Christmas, right? Like, isn't it the case that the best Christmas poetry and literature and even just the best Christmas experiences have a little bit of that back darkening from Halloween in them? I've always thought that. I think Christmas gets too cutesy if you can't sense the Halloween right behind it. All right, y'all. Thank you so much for being here with me for episode 1 of the Greg Brownderville Dimension, and I hope to see you next time.